Thank you for joining today's Tech Talk. This is the last part of our retail cybersecurity series, and it's about helping you monitor for PCI compliance using Splunk. I'm Mary Chen, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Splunk. Joining me today is Dave Harold, our Principal Security Strategist. You may already know him as our co-creator and host for Boss of the SOC competition, but Dave also engages in the security community and trains technical teams around the world. With his experience in payment processing, Dave has developed a process to help you hone in on specifics, build and maintain a secure network that protects cardholder information. Here's the agenda for today. We're going to talk about the state of PCI compliance, why payment card security matters, how PCI compliance is connected to security, and then Dave will walk us through how you can use Splunk Enterprise and Splunk Cloud along with the Splunk app for PCI compliance to monitor for compliance in 5 steps. We're available to answer your questions throughout the session, so just use the Q&A widget within your screen. So what's the state of the PCI compliance? These key findings are taken from Verizon's latest payment security report and infographic. We see an increasing number of organizations unable to obtain and maintain the required compliance for PCI, which has a direct impact on the security of their customers' payment data. In the last few years, we've seen an increase in online fraud and headlines about customer data being stolen, and the impact reaches far beyond IT. The CEO of one of the world's biggest retailers resigned as a direct result of the cardholder data being stolen and millions of cards compromised. Credit card fraud is not a small problem. The US alone is responsible for more than 1/3 of the total global loss, making it the most card fraud prone country in the world. So if you process, store, and transmit credit card data, you're required to be PCI compliant. Retailers and e-commerce merchants across industries that want to continue to qualify for the lowest interchange rates, protect themselves from the risk of potentially devastating fines, chargebacks, and reissuance fees, and continue taking credit card payments at all, they must comply with the PCI standard. When you look at some of the 12 basic requirements for merchants and payment processors, and how they're mapped to the lessons learned from payment breaches, PCI compliance is connected to what really matters: security. The data shown here is based on a 2015 report, but it is still a trend we see today. Breach victims struggle to meet with one or more of these controls due to business demands and changes and complexity in IT environments. Plus, the ongoing prevalence of new technologies like cloud is redefining the environment within which the payment systems must operate. And just as security is a data problem, compliance is a data problem. To measure overall effectiveness and status of PCI technical controls, you need to look at data from operating systems, from firewalls and network elements, databases and applications such as your point of sale. Many merchants apply the correct security standards in their environment, but they struggle to effectively monitor, report, and demonstrate compliance with each control. And that's where Splunk comes in. Splunk enables you to monitor for PCI compliance using a general process. So the first step is to define your cardholder data environment. Then you want to demonstrate compliance with controls within your cardholder data environment. Third step is to remediate any gaps in compliance, report on that compliance. And the last step, it's very critical, is to continuously monitor and remediate gaps in compliance. Dave will now walk us through how you can follow the 5-step process using Splunk.
Hi there, my name is Dave Harold. I'm a principal security strategist here at Splunk. Back in the mid-2000s, before I joined Splunk, I ran a security and compliance program for a payment processing company, and I did that for about 7 years. In that role, in addition to running the security program, I was responsible for maintaining our PCI Level 1 compliance status. Level 1 meant that an external security assessor called a QSA would visit us every year and determine whether we were operating in compliance with the 12 requirements and the 200 plus sub-requirements of the PCI standard. Today, I'm going to draw on that experience as we walk through the 5 steps of PCI compliance monitoring with Splunk that Mary mentioned earlier. Today, we'll primarily talk about the Splunk app for PCI compliance. We'll also mention Splunk Enterprise Security, and we'll talk a little bit about Splunk Cloud and Splunk Enterprise. The first thing to know about the Splunk app for PCI compliance is that it does run very well in Splunk Cloud and is also available in our on-prem Splunk Enterprise software. The documentation for this app is freely available. It's linked in this presentation. You can also find it easily at docs.splunk.com. The app for PCI compliance is compatible with enterprise security, and in fact, it is built on many of the same underlying technical frameworks that enterprise security is built on. The UI is very similar between the two products, and if you know Splunk Enterprise Security, you'll have no problem learning the app for PCI compliance very quickly and easily. The app for PCI compliance is updated to reflect the PCI DSS version 3.2 requirements. And you should know that the app for PCI compliance is licensed in addition to Core Splunk, which means you should talk to your sales team if you're interested in it. Today, we'll talk mostly about how the app works and how it can aid in your PCI compliance. So before we jump into those 5 steps of using Splunk to help you monitor for PCI compliance, let's just take a quick look at the app. We'll show you the major components and we'll give you a sense for what the UI looks like. First, we'll look at the PCI Compliance Posture Dashboard. This is one of the main features of the Splunk app for PCI compliance. It's a high-level summary of your PCI compliance. Now, a big part of PCI is on a daily basis ensuring that you are monitoring everything that's going on in your environment from a security perspective. Behind the scenes, Splunk is doing a lot of hard work for you, gathering logs, gathering telemetry from your systems, your apps, and your networks. It's applying rules to that data, and if there's any problems, it's surfacing them in a number of ways. One of those ways is by showing you on this dashboard that you may have a PCI violation. Those are indicated in red. Now, you'll see this term notable events a lot of times today. Notable events are alerts in the Splunk app for PCI compliance. And so if there's any alerts that indicate a violation of a requirement, then those are indicated here. Now, down below here, we have the different requirements from PCI. We have 10 of the 12 requirements represented here because those are the requirements that the app for PCI compliance supports. And you'll see everything from requirement 1, which is all about network traffic, firewalls, segmentation on your network, and that sort of thing, to requirement 11, which is all about vulnerability scanning of your environment. Now, if there's any problem with any of these requirements, they're surfaced through different icons here, these red icons, or at times you'll see orange icons if there's something that's been identified and open and is in progress. Now, you can also look at things like the number of notable events over time and the number of notable events over time per requirement. Now, in the Splunk app for PCI compliance, if you see something that is concerning, like these requirements here shown in red, we can click on them and it'll take us to another feature of the app for PCI compliance called the PCI scorecard. Now, there's a scorecard, and you can access these directly through this menu up here, but there's a scorecard for every one of the requirements that's supported in the app for PCI compliance. So let's take a look at this scorecard dashboard. The elements on here will tell you a lot about your compliance with that particular requirement. So first, you'll get a status overview. You'll get an indication here of notable events, and this time we're actually aggregating them by urgency. And urgency is something that will tell you sort of about the security urgency of the notable event. Now, they're all compliance notable events, and so you have to deal with them from a compliance perspective. But if you're prioritizing them, you certainly want to look at the ones that have a high urgency, because those are going to be things that are more critical to the actual security of your organization, not just compliance. You'll also see a summary of notable events by owner. You can see their status and how many there are in various statuses. In this case, we have 60 that are brand new and that are unassigned and that we should go have a look at. Now, this views panel in this dashboard is really useful because, again, a big part of PCI is showing that someone in your organization is monitoring what's going on in the systems, the networks, and the applications that make up your card data environment. Well, One way that you can demonstrate that you are monitoring your environment is to show that you're looking at dashboards that represent the state of that environment. And that's what this panel does. So it shows you different views, which is another word for dashboard, and whether or not they've been viewed today or not. And so it's really easy to talk to your assessor and come in and say, look, yes, we've viewed all these things today, and here's proof of that. And not only that, but we can see what user has viewed those today. Now, the notable event history, this one looks a little bit coarse-grained just because this is a demo system, but in a production system, you'd see a nice histogram here representing the notable events for this particular requirement over time. So now that you've seen the app for PCI compliance and just a few of its major features, let's revisit that 5-step process that we talked about earlier. Now you can use Splunk to help you with your PCI compliance, and we broke that down into 5 steps. The first one being define your environment. Step 2 is showing that you're compliant. Step 3 is remediating the inevitable violations that you'll have throughout the year in various small parts of the PCI DSS. Step 4 is reporting, and step 5 is ongoing monitoring. Let's talk about step 1, which is define. The very first thing that you need to do is identify how your organization takes payments. Now, this sounds simple, but it actually can be quite complicated. You might have a website that takes online payments. You might have retail locations. You might have dozens or hundreds of retail locations. Within a single retail location, you might have multiple different ways that payments are accepted. Maybe you have a restaurant in your store. Maybe at your store, customers have to pay for parking. There's a lot of different ways that payment systems can creep into an organization. What I recommend here is to talk to your IT team to understand their sort of view of what the payment infrastructure looks like, but also talk to finance. Finance will have a list of all of the merchant bank accounts that your organization has. And usually you can track back from those merchant accounts to infrastructure in your environment that supports those different types of payments. This is super important. If you don't get this right, what can happen is you can invest a lot of time and a lot of money in a compliance program, and at a very late stage, you might learn that half of your payment infrastructure is not even in the scope of your compliance program, and it can be a very costly mistake. So take your time to do that right. After you identify how you take payments, create data flow diagrams. Data flow diagrams start with the point at which a consumer gives you their credit card information. That might be them typing their credit card number into a website. That might be where a card is swiped or a chip is inserted into a reader. But at that point where that consumer is giving you the card data, then you draw a diagram of every system, application, and network that card data touches as it moves through your environment and to the processor. And sometimes even after it goes to the processor, there'll be some results that are stored. And depending on a lot of different factors, you may actually persist that card data in your environment. You may store it somewhere. A lot of organizations try to avoid that, and you should try to avoid that. But nonetheless, it is something that happens in many environments. So create those data flow diagrams. The first day with your assessor is going to be a great one if you can show them your data flow diagrams. Assessors love this, gives them a frame of reference, and I highly recommend it. Now, data flow diagrams are also important because they drive your definition of your card data environment, or CDE. This is an important acronym to know when you're talking about PCI compliance. The card data environment is the collection of systems and networks and applications where the PCI requirements apply. And there's a lot of things that you can do to limit the scope of your cardholder data environment. And it's one of the few places where you actually have flexibility in PCI. PCI is a pretty rigid standard. You don't have lots of opportunities to sort of influence how it's applied to you. But this is one of those areas where you do have flexibility, and part of PCI is in your control when you are defining your card data environment. So do that very carefully, because it's very expensive to demonstrate all these controls against everything in your card data environment. The smaller it is, the better you will be. You also need to capture the users and the groups who need access to cardholder data. In every environment, there are certain jobs, certain roles within your organization who need access to cardholder data for legitimate business purposes. And you need to capture that because there are many requirements in PCI that center around is access to data authorized or is it unauthorized? And you can only make that determination if you know which roles are supposed to have access and which roles don't need access. So that's an important aspect to capture as well. And finally, we'll now tie this into Splunk, and we'll talk about the asset and identity framework. And this is a feature inside of the Splunk app for PCI compliance. And it's a way for you to capture your card data environment. So all these bullet points are leading up to a point where you have your card data environment and you have your authorized users defined. And then we can load them into the Splunk app for PCI compliance so that it's far more accurate when it's telling you about those violations. It can tell you that a certain type of access is actually a violation because that system is in your card data environment, where the exact same activity on a system outside your card data environment might not be a violation and might not even be a security problem. So carefully defining the environment is what is going to allow you to sort of gain efficiencies in your PCI compliance program. So let's talk about that define step and how we can use that to configure the app for PCI compliance to make it a whole lot more accurate and useful for us as we are trying to comply with the PCI DSS. So if we look at the resource menu here in the app, we'll see two things of interest to us. The first is the Asset Center. The second one is the Identity Center, and we'll look at each one of these in turn. So if we look at the Asset Center, I want to draw your attention down below to this list of assets that we have in our environment. Now, an asset could be a system, it could be a network. In fact, if you look down below, you can see there's CIDR definitions for networks down here. For hosts, we have host name, we have other metadata about that system. We have a priority that can drive that urgency that we talked about before. We have things like its location, its latitude, its longitude, its country. We also, interestingly, have something called business unit or B unit. It is not uncommon in big organizations that have big PCI requirements to break up their PCI assessments and their PCI programs sometimes by business unit. And it's something you have to talk to your QSA about and talk to your acquiring banks and all those folks we mentioned earlier, but it does happen. This gives you the flexibility to handle that situation if you wanted to use this app in such an environment. Now, we also have this category. Category is really important. It's like a tag that we apply to an asset, and we can say, okay, we want to tag this as in our PCI environment. We want to tag it in our cardholder environment. And these are things that are used in other parts of the app to drive whether or not we create an alert or not and draw your attention to something in your logs. Now, we can get even deeper and we can specify this PCI domain. And if you know much about especially the requirement 1 in PCI that talks a lot about network security, there are different rules that apply differently to things like your DMZ than they apply to other parts of your network, like your internal network. Or there are special rules for a wireless network in PCI. And so by giving you the flexibility to put those tags of wireless, cardholder, there's a DMZ domain in here as well. By putting those in there, you can get very sort of accurate about how you raise alerts in the logs that come into your system for your PCI compliance. Now, we capture a few other elements about assets. None of them are too exciting except for requires AV, or AV being antivirus. And if you know about PCI, most systems in your PCI environment are going to require antivirus. And people will argue about Linux and things like that. But generally speaking, if a system supports antivirus, you need to have antivirus on it. And this allows you to specify whether each asset is one such system. So this is a way to essentially take your cardholder data environment that might exist in a spreadsheet somewhere and actually load it into the app for PCI compliance and then use it to help give you sort of visibility into what's going on for compliance in your environment. Now, let's take a look at the other report, or the other dashboard, I'm sorry, that we have here, which is the Identity Center. Remember, when we talked about defining your environment, we want to define who has access to cardholder data. Well, just like we can capture all of our assets, we can capture our users as well. And so we can record things like their identity, some metadata about their first and last name, their email, phone number, who their boss is. We can also give them a priority, and that can drive some of the rules that we have in the system. We have that same business unit category, and here we have categories for things like, are they a privileged user? Are they an officer in the company? And although we don't see it on this page, we have categories for things like cardholder, and we have categories for PCI. And so this also allows you to create content that is not going to be as noisy and create as many false positives because it knows that a certain user is or is not authorized to access cardholder data. So let's move on to step 2, which is show. And it's really all about how do you get a picture of your PCI compliance status. Let's jump right into the app. I've shown you a lot of this already earlier in sort of the simple walkthrough. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but we have the PCI compliance posture that gives you that summary. We also have all those scorecards that we mentioned earlier for each one of these requirements. We have scorecards that show us how we're doing with that particular requirement. Now we also have a list of dozens of different reports that we can use that really drive down to specific things that you need to capture and show evidence of to your PCI assessor. And as you recall, I think we looked at the network traffic firewall rule activity report, for example. And so these are all things that you can show to your assessor. You can actually export these as PDFs. You can print them out. You can export them in just about any format that you would like. So these are the ways primarily that you're showing your compliance status, both to your internal teams and to your assessor. So let's talk about step 3, remediate. Now, even in the most perfect of PCI environments, there are going to be times where events occur and you're actually going to be out of compliance with the PCI DSS. That is almost impossible to architect a system where you will never drop out of compliance. The danger there is staying out of compliance. So what you need to do is architect a system that tells you, hey, we just experienced something that's out of compliance with PCI DSS. Now we need to go fix it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And no surprise, the Splunk app for PCI compliance can help you identify those things and remediate them. So let's take a quick look at the app. So if we start here at our PCI Compliance Posture Dashboard, you see we have 2 requirements that are out of compliance. This is one of those imperfect times where we're not in compliance, or at least there's a likelihood that we're not, right? We need to go figure out what's going on. So if we look at requirement 5, anti-malware protection, and we click on this 275 new notable events, what this will do is take us to a dashboard we haven't seen before. It's called the Incident Review Dashboard. Now, if you're familiar with Splunk Enterprise Security, which is our SIM product, you'll recognize this because it's the exact same dashboard that we use in both. And this is where we do alert management. So an analyst can come into this dashboard and they can see all the alerts that are firing. Now, there's a lot of filtering that goes on at the top of this page. I won't talk about all of it, but there's one part that I will talk about, and that's this search portion. So this is actually where you can put sort of ad hoc Splunk search language directly into this filter. So in this case, we're filtering for governance equals PCI and control equals 5.star, which is a wildcard. And this filters our alerts down to just requirement 5. So now we can come down here and we can look and say, okay, well, we've got alerts down here. We've got some mediums and some highs, and maybe we'll go look at this first high alert. Now, when we expand this, we see a lot of things. Number one, we see a description that's useful to us. It tells us exactly why the system thinks that there's a PCI violation here. It gives us additional metadata, and this comes directly out of the asset framework that we talked about earlier. It gives us information about the event, when did it occur, what's its unique ID, things like that. It also tells us which correlation search drove this alert. Now, alerts and notable events, I use that term interchangeably, but notable events are created when a correlation search in the system finds something. So we have a correlation search called endpoint recurring malware infection rule. We could click on that and go have a look at how that search is constructed, which is useful sometimes. Now we also have something called adaptive response, and this is a way for the system to take an automated response when an alert is fired. And so you can do things like send a special kind of alert maybe in certain situations, or you could even do something like have a system moved from its normal subnet onto a quarantine subnet. You could also use adaptive response as a handoff mechanism to give this alert to a more powerful SOAR system, something like Splunk Phantom, and take all kinds of really involved responsive actions. Now, you can also create next steps. And this is really useful so that when your analyst is looking at this alert, maybe there's a set of 3 steps that they need to go through in order to bring the system back into compliance. And you can easily include those next steps in all these rules. It makes it very powerful. It reduces that amount of time while that your system might be out of compliance due to some external event. So step 4 is report. What I'm not going to do is jump back into the app to show you any specific feature in there because I've already shown you how to do many types of different reports that are very useful for PCI compliance. What I will do is give you some advice. And number one is spend some time doing your homework and determining what your reporting requirements are. There's a lot of factors that play into it. It could be things as simple as the total number of transactions that you process per year. But there's a lot of other things that can also play a part. Like you might even have special instructions from your merchant bank or your acquiring bank or your payment provider, or there may be like certain technologies that you've adopted in your environment that affect whether you need to do sort of more rigorous reporting or less reporting. Go back to step one, where we defined the PCI environment, and there's going to be a lot of answers to the questions that you have here in step four that actually came out in step one, where you defined your PCI environment. Once you understand how you need to report, use the PCI app to provide evidence for that report. There's dozens and dozens of different reports that will allow you to literally drop evidence just directly in for various PCI requirements. As we round this out for the day, I'm going to move on to step 5, which is monitor. And again, we talked about monitoring already in the app, so you've seen demos of that. What I'll tell you about monitoring is that you need to think about PCI every day. And if you treat your PCI assessment as an annual event or a quarterly event when you do your vulnerability scans, generally you're going to have trouble with that. Get in the habit of thinking about PCI every day. It's going to make your assessments and your reporting a whole lot easier. I would also encourage you to adopt a detect and respond mindset. And this is something we talk about all the time in security, but I think we need to use it in compliance as well. And that really is to say, we'll never be perfect. We'll never have the perfectly compliant PCI environment, but what we can do is detect when we're out of compliance and respond as quickly as we can to get our systems back into compliance. So really think about it in those terms. Don't hold yourself to perfection, but hold yourself to essentially, I'm going to be the very best at detecting and responding. The last recommendation is a theme that has been pervasive, hopefully through this presentation, but it's to know thyself. Even if you go back to requirement 1, where we focused on defining your PCI environment, you need to know where your cardholder data is. You need to know the systems and the networks and the applications where that cardholder data is being processed. And you need to know who is accessing your data. And if you know those things inside and out, and you know your environment, you're not only going to be in a lot better position to maintain PCI compliance, but you're going to be a lot more secure too. And that ultimately is the goal here.
Thanks, Dave. We're about ready to wrap up this tech talk. I just wanted to share some additional resources to you so you can continue your digital journey with Splunk. You'll receive these assets in a follow-up email as well as this recording. We also have an incredible community for you to search and ask questions and continue the conversation for this tech talk within the tech talk section. Thank you again for joining.